Economics Program to discuss the issue on Kenya's sovereign debt, whether debt is an option. So you've probably seen from the agenda that was circulated, but I'll go over it shortly. The brief background to this meeting today is that IEA, with the support of the Open Society Initiative for Eastern Africa, has a project with the broad objective of enhancing transparency and accountability in deficit financing. So to achieve this objective, parts of I hope I did not drop off. I'm sorry for that. But basically looking at the question of Kenya's public debt in terms of the quantum, the composition and structure, the questions around the debt tenure, among other critical questions surrounding the issue of public debt. So, and what we aim to do here is to raise the public literacy on the questions of public debt, so as to build critical a mass or to amplify advocacy around more effective debt management strategies. We also hope upon completing this engagement with the CSOs, with the public on public debt, that will also be able to engage with other policy actors, the relevant policy actors, and discuss possible solutions in terms of how they can implement more effective strategies for debt management. So that stated, IEA has been carrying out analysis of the trends in Kenya's public debt. We have the data that is availed by the CBK, but we also have other complementary sources of data, including the World Bank, the IMF reports. So what we've been doing is we've been tracking critical questions in terms of how the movements in our public debt. We have developed a fact sheet. We've provided commentary on several occasions regarding what our analysis is on proper debt management. But for today's webinar, we'll basically be unpacking. We have 3 speakers who will be unpacking the question of restructuring public debt, if it's an option, and they will tell us more about it. So without further ado, I'll just introduce our speakers very quickly and invite them. We'll have a first 10 or 15-minute presentation, 10-minute presentation by Maureen Baraza. Maureen works in the Popular Economy Program. She's a research officer, and she'll be taking us through the analysis of the facts and figures on Kenya's public debt, just the broad overall picture. And then after that, we will have Deborah Mwendwa. She'll discuss the lessons from the debt sustainability analysis conducted by IMF. Deborah is also a research officer under the Popular Economics Program. And then after Deborah's presentation, we will have Kwame Owino. Kwame is the CEO of IEA, and he'll be discussing Kenya's options for debt management. And then after the 3 conclude, we'll open the floor for plenary. So we'll have a Q&A session. I'd encourage you to note your questions down as we go. We have a chat box on this platform, so you can ask any questions that you have there. But we'll also allow you to orally raise your questions during the plenary session. So we'll have a plenary after that, and then we will conclude. So with that, I'll just invite my colleague Maureen to start us off with the facts and figures on public debt in Kenya. Thanks, Maureen.
Okay, thank you, Jackie. I'll just list the outline of what you're going to discuss today. Jackie has already mentioned it. We'll look at the state of play, that's the facts and figures that I'll be doing. Then from there, we'll do the lessons from the debt sustainability analysis from the IMF report. Then Kenya's options for debt management and the consequences of restructuring, which is one of the options. Conclusion. Okay, so on the first slide, we have the size and evolution of Kenya's public debt. And on this chart, it's from Q1 for the financial year 2016-17, all the way to Q1 for the financial year 21-22. And the line shows us the nominal figure of the total public debt in trillions. Currently, the total public debt is at 8.4 trillion, but as for Q1 for the financial year 21-22, it was at 8 trillion. And from this, we can see that the public debts, okay, on the bars, you can see the percentage of public debt to GDP. And from this figure, we can see that public debt as a share of GDP, which is currently at 70% of total public debt. Okay, it's increased all the way up to this quarter to 8.4 trillion, and it's at 70% of the total GDP. And the GDP currently it's at 12.4 trillion. Okay, we can see that the public debt has been, the percentage of public debt has been increasing. The percentage of the proportion of public debt to GDP has been increasing due to expansionary fiscal policies, and the government has been borrowing. And we can also remember that the debt ceiling was increased and it surpassed the previous ceiling of 9 trillion. We are now at 10 trillion. Moving on to the next slide, we have the comparison across regions of debt as a percentage of GDP. And the blue lines are showing the countries in the region that Kenya shares with just around. And we have the orange bar shows the low-income developing countries. The countries that are below the low-income developing countries debt as a percentage of GDP, Congo, Tanzania, and Ethiopia. And we can see that Kenya is at 70.3% of debt as a share of GDP. Okay, it's among the top, and Kenya's debt as a share of GDP is above that of low-income developing countries, which is at 50.3%. Moving on, we're looking at the trend in total public debt, which is in trillion shillings. Debt is comprised of two components. You have the external debt and the domestic debt, and we've computed this and found the external debt as a share of total debt. Total debt is currently at 8.4 trillion, like I had mentioned before. And looking at the composition of both the external and domestic debt, we can see that the external debt as a share of GDP is almost at the same level as that of domestic debt. So it's almost 50-50. Moving on, we're looking at the composition of domestic public debt. The domestic public debt is comprised of treasury bills, treasury bonds, and others, which includes local suppliers. And from this graph, from this chart, we can see that treasury bonds are like the largest share of domestic debt composition, and they tend to have like large interest rates. And also the blue part, which is the treasury bills, we can see that it's rising. In 2013, we had 25% of treasury bills as a composition of the total domestic public debt, then 32%, then 34%. This shows that the government is moving towards short-term loans, because treasury bills are normally short-term, at times a year or so. And about 38% of domestic debt is falling. That's the T-bills, and it's in less than a year. We'll have repaid at least 15% within 2 to 3 years. This is from the medium-term debt management strategy. Then we move on to a breakdown of Kenya's external debts. On top of this chart, we can see that the total debt stock has been increasing all the way from 0.84. The total debt stock for the external debt has been increasing all the way from 0.84 trillion to 4.02 trillion. And on this side, we have the proportions and the years from financial year 2013-14 all the way to 2020-2021. And the breakdown of Kenya's external debt is from the multilateral, bilateral, commercial banks, and suppliers' credit. As much as the external debt to revenue ratio is exhibiting a mixed trend, where some years the multilateral is increasing, it has been decreasing. From 2013 to 2017, it has been decreasing, and it started rising from 2019-20 to 2020-21. There's also a declining ratio. The declining ratio is for the bilateral loans is explained by the improved terms on new loans. Also, we can note that the total debt stock for the external debt stock has been increasing despite the declining proportions in the multilateral, bilateral loans. Moving on, we're looking at the composition of public debt servicing. Servicing has two components. You have the interest and you have the redemption. The interest rates on domestic debt is high and it's increasing rapidly, such that you can say out of every 100 shillings that was paid for interest charges on domestic debt, 73 of it, 73 out of 100 shillings that was paid for interest charges, 73 was domestic. And also looking at redemption for external debts, we can see that it has quadrupled between 2018-19 and 2022-23, and this is explained by the infrastructure bond, the Euro bonds that are due. Moving on, we look at the total against the external debt service as a share of revenue. The total debt service is the one in blue, then the external debt service is the one in orange from the financial years 2014-15 all the way to 2020-21. And you can see that there's a rise in stock of public debt as a share of revenue, the total debt as a share of revenue, and the increases in the cost of debt servicing. And this increases the cost of debt servicing. The rise in debt stock and Eurobond are termed as the reasons behind the peak in total debt service to revenue ratio. That was in 2018-19, which is at 56.7%. Then the external debt service, which is the one in orange, is also exhibiting a mixed trend, where there are some years where it's falling, then it increases in some years, and the declining ratio in the external debt service as a share of revenue is explained by the improved terms on new external loans. Looking at the same chart, you can see that there's a big difference in the total debt service as a share of revenue and the external debt service as a share of revenue, meaning that the domestic debt service as a share of revenue is a huge percentage, meaning most of the debts most of the servicing goes towards domestic debt. Then looking at the external debt service to exports ratio. This chart is mainly important because the external debt is financed through foreign currency, and foreign currency is acquired when we sell exports, and there's a peak ratio of 60.1% on account of, that was in 2018-19, on account of payment of Eurobond, and the external debt service to exports ratio has been declining after that, has been reducing after that. And if exports are not growing, it makes external debt servicing difficult, since external debt servicing is done in forex, and external debt service to exports has also been exhibiting a mixed trend, with a peak in 2018-19, like I said, due to repayment of Eurobond. But generally, it's a mixed trend where in some years it has been decreasing, like 2014-15, it decreased to 12.8, then it increased, then it started reducing at some point in 2019-20. Moving on, we look at the terms on new external loans. That's the average maturity, the grace period, and the average interest rates. When we are looking at the loans, there's the issue of the principal, that's the time, then there's the interest, there's the issue of principal, that's the amount, then we have the time, and we have the interest. So we look at it in terms, using these terms of the maturity, the grace period, and the average interest rate. And looking at it, when the average maturity period is longer, the government gets like more time to repay the loans, and the newly contracted external loans had an average maturity of 23.3 years at the end of June 2021, compared to 26.1 years in June 2020, while the grace period remained unchanged in the same period. The weighted average interest increased to 2.1% in June 2021 from 0.5% in June 2020, and the decline in the average time to maturity and increase in average interest is attributed to the long tenure of analysis of the 20 medium management strategy. This is from the medium-term debt management strategy. Moving on, we have the currency composition of external debt. I remember we say that all external debt is paid in foreign currency. So looking at this chart, we have the as a share of the currency composition, dollars as a share of the total external debt in 2020, and we also have as a share of the total external debt in 2021. And USD occupies like the largest share of currency composition of external debts, and the exchange rate risk is highest for any significant movement of the three dominant currencies that constitute the external debt. That's the dollar, the euro, and the Japanese yen, that are mostly used in repayment of debt. And they also have the Chinese yuan, which is also used in repayment of external debt. And next is
good morning. So right now, since we have the facts on the state of play of the public debt in Kenya, we look at the lessons from debt sustainability analysis by the IMF that was carried out last year in March. So the debt sustainability analysis is a result of the debt sustainability framework that is usually carried out by the IMF. And these are the results as of March 2021. And the risk of external debt distress was high. And also overall risk of debt distress was also high. So we will also look at how the factors that are leading to an increase in the risk of external debt distress and also for the overall risk of debt distress. So next. As you can see, I've divided the presentation into the external debt distress and the overall. And as you've heard, external debt is paid by external currency. And for the overall debt, this is external debt plus domestic debt. So for the external debt distress, we start with the depreciation of the currency. As of today, in the CBK portal, you can see that the dollar rate in Kenya is at 120.01 shillings compared to last year when it was at 109. That means that, as you've seen, 66% of debt is in USD. So that means that Kenya will pay more than it should have paid. So this is increasing the risk of debt distress. For the trade deficit has been increasing. As of 2020, it was at 999 billion Kenyan shillings, and for last year, it has increased up to 1.4 trillion. That means that Kenya is continuing to import more than it's exporting, and it's through the exports that we'll be able to get the currency to pay the external debt. Then central bank reserves have been decreasing. When you check the central bank weekly bulletins, they post the foreign reserves, and as of June this year, they were at 8.1 billion. So as of last week, they have reduced down to 7.6 billion. So if the central bank reserves are reducing for the foreign reserves, for the foreign currency, that means that there's high risk of the debt distress since there's less capability to pay the external debt. The Eurobond trade, the interest rate has been increasing and there has been a high rate of trade. And this shows that people are worried about the debt distress currently in Kenya. So now for the overall debt, which is the external plus the domestic, as you know, in June this year, the parliament increased the debt ceiling from 9 trillion to 10 trillion. That shows that this shows that there's pressure from the government to finance its budget deficit, so it has to increase more, and they cannot borrow above the debt ceiling. So increasing the debt ceiling shows that we are increasing more room to borrow, and this is increasing the risk of debt distress. Deficit as well has been increasing since there has been more expenses compared to the revenue of Kenya. And also for the fuel and food subsidies, you're all aware of the maize subsidy that was introduced by the government together with the fuel subsidy. This means that the government had to spend more expenses than it had planned before. So this is increasing the expenses, and yet there is the expense to pay back the loan. So this is increasing the debt distress risk. However, there's a positive effect on reducing the risk of debt distress on the IMF program and moderate tax. The moderate tax has been increasing, and this shows that the revenue will increase. So we will be able to pay back the loan with the revenue that has been increased from the increase in tax. And for the IMF program with Kenya, it has supported Kenya with a response to global shocks of 2022. And also it has designed a fiscal consolidation, which is accompanied by structural reforms to protect the fiscal space of Kenya. So the two factors of the moderate tax increasing and the IMF program with Kenya are helping to reduce the debt distress risk. But as you can see, there are more factors that are increasing the risk compared to those that are reducing. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. So this is where we are. We've come from an examination of the facts of public debt in Kenya based on declared debt over the last 10 years, and we've seen two things. One, Maureen has confirmed to us two things. One, the quantum of debt has been growing in nominal terms. That's expected. The share of debt, debt as a share of GDP has also been growing, suggesting to us that debt obligations are growing much faster than general GDP growth. And that's leading to the quantum of debt, or the proportion of debt as a share of GDP has been going up. Then she also showed us that in the split, it's almost at a parity. About 51% of all public debt is sovereign. Sovereign debt is external, with the rest being internal debt. In that same period, there's been a fluctuation, but generally, the tenure of debt, which is basically the aging of debt over time, has actually, with the exception of I think 2 years, became worse, suggesting that all that debt, in terms of its structure, has shorter cycles. And I think among the things that the debt management strategy that they referred to shows is government actually understands that lengthening the tenure of debt is one of the problems. So COVID didn't make anything better, but certainly COVID was not the cause. What COVID did was actually just provided an opportunity for those risks that already existed in the structure of Kenya's public debt to show or to become more salient. And then we come to Deborah. Remember that by March of last year, as Kenya entered a program with the IMF, part of that obviously was because debt distress signals were already showing. And with those debt distress signals showing, the sovereign country entered into an IMF program. That IMF program provided us an opportunity for the first assessment before that program could be entered into. The assessment showed that Kenya was under the possibility of distress. I'd like to remind us that in general, the IMF uses diplomatic language. So even if they think those risks are elevated and high, it's not for them, or they usually eschew the call out to suggest that a country would be in trouble. But the fact that Kenya went into that program on time provides certain buffers, because it comes with certain promises for certain milestones achieved. Then obviously it will be useful. It's also a useful signal globally, because if you can tell that 50% of Kenya's sovereign debt is owed to external people, to enter in an IMF program, which tends to be extremely rigorous, I think, regardless of what you think about them, the IMF is one of the most qualified institutions to do the kind of debt sustainability analysis and to prepare a sovereign nation for a glide path, a safe glide path over time. Not successful, but a safe glide path, because it gives confidence to other external people who are owed money, so basically creditors, for instance. So that's a significant thing. And then Deborah told us that since that time, because the debt sustainability analysis was carried out, certain things have happened, which suggests a consolidation. Or rather, one of the conclusions of the IMF that the only path for Kenya would be actually fiscal consolidation. And fiscal consolidation is just an economist's sophisticated way of saying simple things, which is a country needs to reduce its expenses by cutting out wastage, reducing corruption, for instance, and investing in the most important things. And at the same time, raise tax collection, whether it's through new taxes or closing loopholes. By bringing those two together, I think it allows for space to be able to pay debts, but also to have growth restored and to be sustained over time. So that's what has happened since that time. So what we are asking ourselves then is, okay, there are certain things that have happened. Some are are good, some are not. And the most important ones in terms of pressures that suggest to good things is one, the program has maintained, and Kenya seems to have been performing well. The last program report in April of this year, released in May, suggests that Kenya managed to keep most, not all, but most of them. So the program is stable and is going on. And so that's the background. Now, other things, obviously, such as the problem with public, or rather with the currency. Of course, the currency has depreciated quite a bit from about 108, 109 before the close of the year. It's about 120 today, and some of the pressure suggests that it's not over yet. What that means is that if 50% of the debt is owed to foreigners, every 1 shilling change changes the profile of the debt. I mean, changes the quantum of the debt quite a bit. And I think that's happened. That's happened too. Time to a lot of things have happened in the global economy. One of them, obviously, Sri Lanka. In May of this year, Sri Lanka, with fiscal so the world is not a very safe place, and obviously carrying debt distress for a long time can have some consequences. So this part of our discussion is just basically a reasoning about what are some of the things that could happen. It is also informed by the fact that we have a presidential election that is not complete. Each of the leading presidential candidates had manifestos that actually contemplated the possibility that Kenya might actually have to consider, because the possibility of a debt default is high. It's to be avoided, and part of avoiding that is what is called debt restructuring. So let's look at what debt restructuring and financing options are. Now, in modern terms, one of the things that governments do is that when they have bonds issued out, and you've seen that some of the bonds that the government has issued, especially those that are related to external bonds, the profile of Kenya's debt has been such that government of Kenya owes more money to corporations or corporate bonds, commercial bonds, which are basically banks and other people who hold part of Kenya's public debt. And they can trade that debt in a secondary market, such as the Euro bonds, which are traded in markets in the stock exchange in Ireland. But what that means is that that bond can be traded over to somebody, and the rate at which it trades is itself a signal about what the credibility of the government is, or the sovereign is, in terms of its ability to pay. So if people think that its ability to pay would be affected, then what tends to happen is that the secondary market actually shifts upwards, the interest rates that is charged for those bonds to be held in the secondary market. So debt refinancing is that option that a country reaches when the possibility of a default happens. And of course, if a default happens, I mean, it's got terrible macroeconomic consequences. We can ask Sri Lankans about that. It has serious macroeconomic consequences, obviously significant disruptions to the economy. So it is better if a government sooner than later approaches those that it owes and hopes to do some kind of debt restructuring. It spooks markets, and it especially spooks people who own those bonds, because they know some terrible things might happen to them as well. But let's ask ourselves first, what is the significance of debt restructuring? And I think some of the language of debt restructuring has been some very loose analysis, including in Kenya's business press, and that here is an opportunity for us to actually try and put some coherence to it. Now, when a country is under pressure with debtors, as might happen if a condition of debt distress is maintained for a very, very long time, and other shocks happen. Sometimes it can be because a country has chosen, but often in Kenya's case, we think that COVID-19 notwithstanding, the choices the government made in public debt management were suboptimal, and they're bad, and they're partly responsible for the situation in which Kenya finds itself today, the sovereign debt. So countries can do three things when you're faced with a debt distress position. You can do market interruptions. Let's go back to the last one, the one before. Yes, so market interruptions, I mean, you can do market interventions using your reserves. So government of Kenya could use its reserves to pay. Reserves might not exist. As you can see, reserves on the exchange, on foreign exchange are actually introducing. You can borrow some more, which is usually not possible. As you know, that the government of Kenya had expected to issue Euro bonds this year, which was suspended because the interest rates that commercial buyers were trying to charge, because they see Kenya as a little bit more risky, were too high, and this was suspended. The final position is, before a debt crash takes place, which is a default, debt restructuring might become necessary. Now, we're not saying Kenya will necessarily go to it, but we are concerned at the Institute of Economic Affairs because if the debt distress conditions do not, if they obtain for much, much longer, say a year or more, the possibility of a debt restructuring is one that will become more and more real. So debt restructuring is basically a legal process of exchange where outstanding sovereign debt instruments, whether bonds and loans, are changed for new instruments and terms. In other words, it's a condition in which a political choice or a policy choice is made by a government to bring together all those who are owed and to say, look, we might not be able to meet our obligations in both the short and medium term. We need to do something so that we're still able to pay you. And that has significant shocks because if you call people up there, so the restructuring is a process based on a political or policy decision, and it's going to have implications for how obligations that obtain based on existing contracts would be handled. So it's supposed to reduce the cost of resolving unsustainable debts. And it's often a sovereign's decision whether to restructure debt or not, especially for a sovereign that does not wish for a default to take place. No country wishes for a default to take place unless it does. But the experience that we've examined shows us that defaults take place more often than necessary because people try to delay a restructuring for too long. Perhaps for fear of the markets, sometimes that fear is ghost, but more often than not because people think actually we have this in control and it continues for a very, very long time. In Kenya's case, that's even possible because when you don't have sufficient transparency in the debt process, it's not possible for citizens to really tell how close a default is and how bad things are has happened in Sri Lanka. So just the promises that, look, we have this issue in control because it has political consequences for a government to concede that the management has not been good. So that's basically the definition. It's a process in which a sovereign manages. And remember, it's not only for external people, though it can be triggered by external circumstances. It's just basically bringing all holders of sovereign debt together and telling them, look, we have the risk of a default, but we'd like to respect contractual obligations and actually perhaps renegotiate them. So that's one part of it. Now, going to the next slide. So what are the fundamentals of restructuring? Remember, every child who studies in Kenya knows at some times in your primary school that you're taught about what the principles of the three main variables in a loan are. One is the principal, the other is the rate of interest, and the time. That's what tells you what the obligation is. That's the same mathematics that applies to sovereign debt restructuring because it's saying the tools of debt restructuring are only three. Only three. One, what do we do with the principal sum, which is basically the amount was borrowed? What do we do with the interest rates, which is the rate of the debt, the rate that is paid? Or what do we do with the time component? So it's basically the principal, the interest rates, and the time. And so when a government or a sovereign brings in that conversation with others, it tends to be a very difficult one, often mediated by the IMF itself, because it gives confidence to external people that this government intends to hold its promises when a restructuring takes place, but also the transparency that is required for people to make that decision comes into play. So they're the only three tools, and sometimes they can be a mixture of them. Now, so reducing the principal of the debt is what is a haircut. You're telling people who lent a sovereign that, look, you lent X billion shillings or X $100,000 or whatever number, millions of dollars. We're in a situation in which we may not be able to pay you. So please, let's negotiate whether you should take a haircut. Few people are willing to do that nevertheless. But often, when push comes to shove, everybody will say first, we are not going to do that. We'll do terrible things to your name in the international markets. You may never be able to borrow again. Often they're bluffing. They're bluffing. But basically what a government is saying is, look, we'd like to plan how to do a reduction of the principal on the debt, reduce the interest on the debt, or extend the maturities. Now, each of those has significant ones, and sometimes there can be a mix and match of them. But in all, what a government is saying is we need to make adjustments that enable us or give us easements in the principal, in the interest rates, or in the maturities. And when you extend maturities, what you're doing is what is called reprofiling in the financial architecture language, which is basically if a loan is due over 20 years, for instance, and you cannot pay the next installments, then what you do is, can we stretch the maturity, which means stretch the tenure, and then have smaller and smaller slices to pay over a larger period of time. Or a grace period is interfaced, And then obviously it resumes after some time to allow for a country to manage its liquidity in the short term. That's just it. It's these three things or a mixture of them that is what restructuring language does. Of course, it goes with very difficult negotiations one way or the other, who goes first in. And so what you can see here is restructuring is basically, sovereign debt restructuring is actually like a global or an international mechanism for managing bankruptcy or solvency. It's just it. There's no law. The IMF tried to introduce one, but countries did not buy into it. I think principally the US was also opposed to it. But the point is this: we are trying to restructure a debt by changing any one of these variables or a mixture of them. And each of them has specific things. A mechanism does not exist. And so when a country comes in here, sometimes with the IMF's backing, then it's something that's very, very difficult. It could take time. I think the classical one was Greece, but also more importantly, in 2001, Argentina went through a restructuring phase of these kinds with everybody's kicking dust, financial people kicking dust and saying, we will never lend you any money again. Well, eventually they did, so I don't know why they laughed like that, but maybe they scared people who are more scared. So in a way, it is an admission by everybody who's in this port that something about the way we lend this sovereign country has gone wrong. Maybe it's our fault, maybe it's somebody else's fault, or it's a shock. It's a global shock, for instance, that could happen. Or if, as happened in Pakistan, God forbid, you have a flood, it might affect economic performance in a way that makes debts that exist difficult to service in the immediate term. So that's it. So let's just remember that a restructuring, all the language that is out there, when you strip it, comes down to these three tools. We are reducing the debt by taking haircuts. We are reducing the interest rate. So for instance, saying we are shaving off an interest rate of whatever amount it be, would shave off by a few percentage points that would apply round or to some specific kinds, or you could extend it. The risks of this obviously is commercial ostracization, right? Where people say like, look, if Kenya restructures its debt, we will never lend you any money again. As I've said, sometimes they're bluffing, sometimes they're bluffing, but obviously adjustments in the interest rates is the way they punish countries that do this. But on the whole, they have no choice. And sometimes when a country is already in a position in which debt restructuring becomes necessary, I think everybody just tries to make sure that they cover their corner. But there are not too many options. This is a bad situation to be in. So we're not trying to make it look like it's a rosy thing. So we go now to the process. Next slide, please. So what are some of the consequences of restructuring? I think the first consequence, as you can see, is basically it damages the reputation of a country. It doesn't stick for long. I mean, Argentina holds the classical case of the number of times that it has defaulted on debt. It's such a big economy. Every time people claim they're not happy. I mean, they go to courts all over, but still it gets it. And I think it's in pressure again. So it comes down with some burden. On the domestic side, obviously, to restructure means that the economic model and the kind of promise that a country has to make might involve increasing taxes, raising taxes, in order to be able to service over time. We've seen some of that happening in Kenya as well, even if obviously there's been no default and the restructuring has not happened. Part of that is you might have to strip off subsidies, which means a country has to start saying that, look, we promise that part of making sure that we have the economy running on full force again as soon as it's possible, so that we agree to the adjustments that you've given us. We have skin in the game. We are going to do some of these very painful things in the immediate time so that we have a chance to do that. I mean, we have a chance, and we promise the vitality of the economy will be restored so that we can pay you. Sometimes you cut public payments, and some pensions actually have been suspended. So whether it's Argentina, Uruguay a few years back, you remember Greece as well. So restructuring is not a low-income country thing. In fact, more often than not, it's medium-income countries and countries that have access to global markets and commercial debt that have had some of the most spectacular instances of restructuring processes over the last few years. There are global law firms that are also good at actually hosting and structuring these documents to ensure, because what happens, remember, it's a legal process. So a restructuring process is not only a legal process, it's a political decision-making, it's a financial process about how you shift the variables, and it's also an economics one by saying what effect would you have. So it's a very, in a way, convoluted process, but in general, you're simply using the three tools that are available: reducing the interest, adjusting interest, adjusting principal, or extending the maturities. with some of the consequences that come. So here we are trying to talk about the consequences, not the political ones, but the economic consequences in the sovereign or in the domestic economy for the country that's proposing that. And among the things that a negotiator does is actually to try and put together a hierarchy of the debts. Multilateral debts tend to be kept out of the restructuring process, so those ones will be paid regardless. Remember, the IMF is also up there sometimes mediating this, so that means obviously that there's no way it's going to allow for some of the debts that are owed to it and its brother multilateral institutions to be. So a hierarchy will be established, and the lower down in the hierarchy, a debtor is, a creditor is, the more likely they're going to take a haircut, or whether it's going to be an adjustment in the interest rates, because that is what a restructuring requires to be done, or whether they're going to defer payments until a later date. So it's basically about lining up. Now, in the next slide, as we conclude, so basically what we're asking ourselves, is debt restructuring for Kenya a possibility? I think we have to conclude that it is. It's still small, but it's significant. And the possibility today, in our view, is higher than it was when the first debt sustainability analysis, the last debt sustainability analysis that we referred to was made. It's a process, in our view, that should happen sooner than later, if it must happen. But at the same time, the function for our discussion today is not necessarily that it's an inevitability. It's just to prepare us for what it means, to make sure that we clarify the language. Restructuring processes is just about basically how you manipulate the three tools, as we talked about, to get a better outcome. But it is not without costs. Some of those costs are reputational. I think sometimes they're exaggerated globally, but some of those costs are borne by the nationals of the country that is undergoing the structuring. All factors considered, it is usually a much better thing than a default, because a default simply means that the restructuring will happen under more aggressive terms and will be damaging to the economy and to everybody else. What this means, in our view, is it is telling us that a restructuring and any condition that brings us where we are happens because public debt management policies or public debt management capacity did not exist or for some reason fails. So it's all very related to policy management and the competence of those who manage the public policy. It also means that in Kenya's case, to make a clear case for whether that would be necessary or not, I think more transparency about who's owed around the three tools, so that you see how those three tools applies to every single debt instrument is essential, so that we can talk about how easy it is. I hope we have not suggested that it's easy. It isn't. In Argentina's case, it took a full 5-year cycle before the debt restructuring agreement was made. Obviously, with a lot of people fingers burned and many more cases that went including to US courts. But debt defaults and debt restructuring have happened far, far more frequently than actually we know. And obviously, the best way obviously is debt forgiveness. I think, as you know, Kenya's debt is not only Chinese. I think countries tend to diagnose this question very, very clearly, whether it's a sovereign, another sovereign, a bilateral debt, or whether it comes down to commercial debt before anybody allows for debt forgiveness at that kind of argument. But the restructuring process is not an easy process, and I hope Kenya doesn't go through it. But regardless of that, we are concerned that between April of last year and August today, there are certain things across the meter that suggest that it might be closer than it was at that time. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thanks a lot to our three speakers, starting with Maureen, who laid the foundation on the facts and figures, basically the state of play on Kenya's public debt, followed by Deborah. Thank you. She highlighted some key lessons on the debt sustainability analysis, and Kwame has done a proper comprehensive summary of that, of the two presentations. And then thanks also to Kwame, who's laid out or rather discussed what some of the options are for debt management. So that stated, I'd like to open up this session for plenary and welcome anyone who might have a question. If you could raise your hand. I don't see any question in the chat box, so I don't know if anyone has a question. So you could raise your hand, and then I'll allow you to orally ask your question. Yes, I see a hand from Okoth Edwin. So yes, please unmute yourself, ask your question, who you'd like to address it to.
Right, thank you.
Edwin, you're welcome.
We have question for admin and treasury, which options they are considering. If in his own opinion, what options does he think Kenya has addressing this lesson? Which one is the lesser evil, because having the lesser evil?
Jackie, please unmute yourself kindly.
Oh, sorry. Okay, thanks. Sorry, Edwin, could you please repeat your question?
So I wanted to ask whether we have any indication from our debt service department at Treasury, whether we have any indication, any sign that Kenya is considering any of those options to address its debt. And from your own understanding or from your own analysis, which of the options is a lesser evil for the country, considering where we are in terms of our debt levels?
Great. Okay, thank you. I saw, Andrea, did you have a question? You had unmuted yourself. Okay, so before we get any other questions, I think that's a question to Kwame, because it's on the options for debt management. In your view, do you, which of the options proposed regarding the fundamentals for debt restructuring would be a lesser evil, and do we have any indications as to whether the Treasury is considering any of them?
All right. What's the question? Was it Edwin? Edwin, no, I don't know. Let me say that you consider one of the things about what we are doing here is a thought experiment based on the fact that for us at the IEA, when we tried to, and we did not weigh through a model, but we just asked ourselves, if you look at the qualitative position of Kenya today relative to when the debt sustainability analysis was carried out in March 2011, March 2021, before the IMF program started. And we looked specifically on the stressors on external debt and overall debt, which were already high. We are thinking that some of the factors that my colleague mentioned suggest that the stress has not relieved, it might have become worse. And remember, it was already high distress on the external side. And the external side, the major driver has been the exchange rate depreciation, which obviously was a big risk, which was mentioned in there, and the CBK had also mentioned in other publications. So if you take those together, it is just simply telling us that if you're on a spectrum, say from one end to the other, where on one end a debt restructuring will not be necessary, and on the other, the possibility of distress has become worse. It's moved a little bit towards the worst side, which means it is important for us as Kenyans to contemplate the possibility that a debt restructuring might be necessary within the medium term to short term. That's all we can say. We don't know what people in Treasury are thinking. We are not psychologists, so we can't read their minds. However, because they look at the numbers every day, I'm sure they probably have a glide path, because there's a plan with the IMF that they intend to adhere to 38 months. I think it's 38 months plan. I think we're not even at the halfway stage yet. So that's basically what we do. Again, if we knew the full portfolio debt, then it is possible that based on the full portfolio debt, we would say, remember what the consequences of a reduction of a restructuring does is this. If you reduce the principal, you're telling especially the commercial people who owe money that they'll take a lower principal, they'll lose some of the money up there. If you reduce the interest rates, you're actually telling them that the value of the total loan will be less, right? You pay the principal, but obviously if they expected, say, 7% and you're reducing it to 5%, you're telling them that they lose that amount of 2% for the full tenure of the loan. So you're actually shrinking their property rights in some way, renegotiating them. If you extend the maturities, it might mean two things. It means you're simply telling them to give you more space, basically, which might mean you get a longer period before you start to pay, and then the period might remain the same, or you might adjust that period. So in this way, you are asking them to actually make the loan in their loan books stay for longer than had been anticipated. Remember, it can also be mixed and matched, and when you mix and match, that's when it becomes increasingly complex. But that's the point. Among the things you do is what debt will not be restructured, or which ones will not have an adjustment. It is unlikely to have, in the hierarchy of payments, it's unlikely to be the ones that come from multilateral people, because those are the institutions that actually usually come in, and their function is to help with these risks. Short-term debts are sometimes also have a higher hierarchy in the sense that they will not be adjusted by virtue of the fact that a government would say, look, if we restructure our debt and we're not able to get external debt and commercial debt, one of the people we might have to pay to keep us rolling in the immediate term are definitely the people we owe short-term debt. And as you can see, Kenya had a profile of short-term debt that's been rising. The tenure has not been shifted quite a bit. So those are the things that we consider. But I will not tell you that I know that Kenya will certainly go for restructuring. I will not tell you that if that restructuring was to happen, this is what it is. We need to see the full portfolio of debt and disclosures that are extremely, extremely detailed to make that argument. I hope this is useful. Thanks.
Okay, thanks for that. So there's a question. I see another hand up, so I'm coming to you, Edwin. But before that, there's a question by Andrea. Andrea asks, do you have any idea already what a Ruto presidency or an Odinga presidency would actually do about debt? I looked at both their manifestos and media quotes, and they were very vague. I don't think the incoming president would have much time to address this issue. I think it's the same. Yeah, it's the same question repeated. So I think because we also did an analysis of the various party manifestos. So I'll ask all the speakers to respond to that. But before we come to the responses, the other hand up was by Edwin. Edwin, you could please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yeah, this is a quick follow-up to the one I asked before, because I've had Kwame saying that you can only make proper judgment if you have full disclosure of debt. Then I would also want to know how transparent is our debt stock, because it looks like we don't have a full disclosure of what we owe, what the debt stock looks like. And secondly, on the spectrum of borrowing, if we have seen that now we are going for short-term loan and domestic loan, how is that? How does that play for us? Is it a safer place if we are running away from interest? I mean, increasing risk from foreign currency risk. If we're running away from foreign currency risk, is it safer if we go local and short term? Is that anything better? Thanks.
Great, thanks for that. There's another Edwin, Edwin Mango. Edwin, you could unmute yourself.
Thanks, Jackie. And mine is really, a short one. So given the option, Kwame has talked about restructuring and the possibility that it might not happen. But we've seen, especially the recurrent expenditure, public, recurrent expenditure, and the debt ceiling, review of the debt ceiling appears to be government strategy in terms of getting more money, to borrow more and, to be able to finance its programs. So if debt restructuring is not a possibility, are we looking at another possibly, debt ceiling review in that case? And if that is not possible, do we have any other, ways of financing government programs, or is there a possibility then there would be a freeze on these government programs, especially the development programs with regards to infrastructure? So that has been very much pursued, especially in the Jubilee administration. But I think there are some other development projects, infrastructures that are now stalled, not fully financed. And does that put even more pressure to our debt ceiling, or the need to review that again? Thank you.
Thanks, Edwin. Elvis, I see your hand is up. You can also unmute yourself and ask your question. Elvis, are you able to? Okay, so I can't hear Elvis, so maybe he has a challenge in unmuting himself. So before that, I'll ask. Yes, yes, I hear you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Kwame, for your presentation, which was on point. However, from the look, it seems we are in a very messy position, and probably I'd like him to comment on government pronunciation, especially on budget policy statement that they'll be implementing fiscal consolidation measures, which, as we know, it has never been happening, and that's why we're in a situation we're in today. From my observation, I'm sure that although the Kenya Revenue Authority announced that they were able to collect to meet their target, but it appears that county governments, most of them even did not receive their full share of national revenue. We have pending bills both at national and county government, in addition to the debt that you just presented about. So I don't know what fiscal space do you think, Mr. Kwame, the next government will have in terms of implementing their manifestos that they've already presented to the citizen, and what is the future for our country in general? Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Elvis. So to answer that, I think we'll start with. I'll start with Maureen. There was a question regarding how transparent our debt stock is, and in terms of when you were going about the data collection and in the analysis, what have been some of your observations in terms of are we able to access information regarding the quantum, the utilization of the debt? What are your views in terms of the transparency? And then I'll come to Deborah to respond to the question on whether you think another debt ceiling raise might be the consideration that might be coming up in case we are not able to, the next government does not do the restructuring. So Maureen, you can start, and then we come to Deborah. Maureen, you are muted. Yeah. Please unmute yourself. You are muted.
I have issues. I'll use this. Okay, regarding the transparency in data from government sources, say the central bank and the treasury, and also the medium-term debt management strategy, we've been able to find data from the various sources, and the data has been in sync all across. Yeah, it has not been an issue. Yeah, thanks.
And on the question on the probability of debt ceiling being raised, yeah, there is high probability since the ceiling can't be violated. So if the deficit continues to increase, there is high probability that Parliament will also go and review the debt ceiling.
Okay, and there was also a question about whether it is safer to go local given the currency risks and the trends that we've seen from Maureen's presentation on the rising costs in terms of servicing the local, the domestic debt in comparison to the external debt, but there are risks for both, given that the external debt has the risks associated with currency fluctuations. So what are your views? Maureen, you can answer that later, in terms of which is safe. Is it safer? I think Edwin asked whether it's safer to go local, or what's the balance there? But as you think about that, I'll invite Kwame to respond to there have been about 3 questions that he was asked. So Kwame?
All right. Yeah, so you have 3 questions. The first is, how transparent is Kenya debt? I mean, debt disclosures in Kenya are made available on a regular basis, but the problem is it's not just about transparency, it's the level of disaggregation. So what it does is that basically it's very highly aggregated. So government tells, the Treasury releases that debt management report every year, and the way it is released to Parliament based on the requirements of the Constitution is in a very aggregated sense. So you say, this is what we owe to each of these donors in an aggregated sense. So for instance, if you have 5 different loans or agreements with a sovereign country such as, say, for the lack of a better example, say Uganda. If you owed Uganda 5 different loans for 5 different projects, they're all put together and consolidated as one. So when you sit at the IEA, you cannot decompose them and find out which of these loans attracts what interest rates and what's the tenure. And they simply aggregate. So in a way, the information is available, but the quality of the details. So my colleagues say that it's all assembled and it's we have no problem. It's true. It tends to triangulate and you find it, but the quality of detail. So reporting in general would require, on this date, this was concluded as the agreement. This is the tenure, this is the interest rates, and this is when the payments are coming and the structure of payments. Because sometimes not all agreements ask you to pay every year. There's some things that are called bullet payments, where every year you simply pay the interest, and then every 5th or every 7th year, or at the end of the loan, you pay the entire principal. So understanding that kind of structure is essential for seeing actually what are the real risks that apply. That is not available from Treasury. That information should be in there, and I think it should be made available, because then it makes conversations such as this more meaningful, right? Because there are some things that people get. So if you have a growing tenure of, say, in 1 year, the tenure of all loans, say, for instance, is 17 years, and then in next year, the tenure has shrunk. It could have shrunk because of one big loan, right? And so the ability to actually strip off and actually find out which specific loans by which structure gives the entire risk profile, one character or the other, is what is not possible now based on the disclosures that the Treasury does. And I think there should be an insistence both from professionals, from Kenyan and Parliament itself, to insist on those disclosures to that level of detail, because they exist. So I think that's one issue. So transparency, I think we are just halfway up there. Now, the debt ceiling review, I think we need to understand simple things. Restructuring, the ceiling is not restructuring. The ceiling is a method of, because the Constitution and the Public Finance Management requires Parliament to be informed about what a ceiling is. Parliament has established, or rather, the Parliament is responsible for debt obligations and its payment. So Parliament places a ceiling, which means you cannot borrow beyond this without seeking new authorization. So it's a method of facilitating or ensuring authorization. So if authorization was raised from 8 billion, from 9 trillion, for instance, to 10 trillion, it only means Parliament has given room for the Treasury to conclude debts up to that 10 trillion measure. It is not a restructuring. It is just a new way in which Parliament oversight is exercised or is shown over debt. It's not a restructuring thing. A restructuring means going back to the people that you owe and telling them that we owe you 40 billion for this railway or that road. We are having problems with payment because of the shocks of COVID, because of maybe something that happened to our economy or something else. We do not want to default. Please allow us to discuss with you and all the other people that we owe on new payment terms in order to avoid the risk of insolvency or the risk of a default. That's basically it. So look at restructuring as a methodology for resolving an insolvency. So it's like a bankruptcy argument, where you bring together all the people and actually initiate. So if it was a company, if Kenya was a company, a restructuring would be the equivalent of creditors and debtors coming together to discuss how to make sure that obligations are still respected. And some adjustments might have to be made by both parties regarding what the contract is. So one is about contract obligations. The other is an oversight mechanism on behalf of Parliament. At the IEA, I specifically think that given the way that we run, the debt ceilings that we have in Kenya perform no role at all in helping in the management of debt. It just allows Treasury a very wide leeway to go out there and conclude debt of any kind and say, no, but we haven't passed the ceiling. And yet the quality of the debt itself and the structure of the debt and what it means for sustainability over the long term has not been addressed by the debt ceiling. So please, let's separate those. So debt ceiling, the debt ceiling that was given this year was to allow for the borrowing that that Treasury anticipates to fill the deficit, I think about 700 to 800 billion to occur. It would not have been possible. So it was lifted to allow for the borrowing for this year to be done. We think within another year or less, actually, that debt ceiling is going to have to be raised again. So it has nothing at all to do with restructuring. It's just basically an accountability tool. Fiscal consolidation measures. Now, Elvis, we made reference to the debt sustainability analysis, which was conducted by the IMF and the IDA and published last year in April, just before the new program between the IMF and Kenya started, the new program. And one of the things that it stated was high risk for external debt distress and high risk for overall debt distress. All those are triggers. As we said, the US, the IMF tends to be very diplomatic at that. But basically, those are signals we should read as citizens and as professionals are suggesting it's not a very good place to be in. And therefore, it would require very keen management over the next few years to ensure that this does not come back down. This does not come back down to a condition of default or possible disruption. So what does that mean? Fiscal consolidation, again, is just technical language for two things. A government will have to do two things to resolve the debt distress situation. Make sure that you close the gap between your spending and the revenues, because that's what a deficit is. So you try to close that gap. And how do you close that gap? Raise taxes and close tax loopholes, which the government of Kenya is already doing. And as my colleague Deborah said, that's one of the good arrows that's happening. So you're raising more taxes and closing that gap, but at the same time, reducing expenditure. On the reduction of expenditure part, we don't think that has happened well enough. Even if the government has actually done something good by suspending any new wage increments until this issue is resolved. So obviously those adjustments are already happening. But we say as well that we spent an additional 80 billion that was not anticipated on fuel subsidies. That's not a good signal. Then we have food subsidies, not a good signal. And all those other expenditures that are happening that show that the financial discipline that is required to bring this debt resolution problem is having increased challenges. And in our view, that's what's tilting the needle closer to the possibility that the debt distress may generate a situation in which a default or a restructuring might be necessary. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. So I think there's a question that maybe we have not answered expressly regarding what either of the incoming presidents would actually do about debt. Someone Andrea sought clarification in terms of your thoughts on what options they have. Maybe all the speakers can comment on that, but I see a question by Emmanuel. Emmanuel asks, if we go without debt restructuring and any form of fiscal consolidation program, do we run the risk of driving right into a forced decision, that is demands and pressure from creditors to restructure, or perhaps default? Yeah, so Emmanuel is basically asking if we do not propose to restructure itself, make the circumstances actually force the restructuring to happen. We'd like to hear your views on that. So that's for you, Kwame. And then Francis Charo asks, from the data presented on the debt trends, there has been a sharp increment from March 21 to 22, from the 7.34 trillion to 8.34 trillion. And he's asking, what is our country policy on the same? We have seen our MPs changing the debt ceiling even without considering the impact. So Maureen and Debbie, you can attempt to answer that. What's the significance of that sharp increase? And then Adrian says, Michael Hudson, debt that can't be paid won't be paid. I think that's basically a comment, but if any of you would like to add something on that or comment on that, I'd welcome thoughts. Then Isaac is asking, between increase of tax, stripping of subsidies, and cutting of public payments, what, in your opinion, is the least painful and most feasible option for Kenya? Okay. So again, Debbie, you can answer that, but Kwame will also chip in. Then Adrian asks, Kwame, even Japan is offering subsidies to their citizens on energy. The US now has an Inflation Reduction Act. Would you rather have a revolution or unrest? Okay, so we start with, I'll start with you, Debbie. Any responses you might have to the questions that have been posed so far?
Okay, thank you. I'll start with the one on increase of tax, stripping of subsidies, and cutting of public payments. They're all painful. It's not like there's any that is better. And yeah, Kwame will add on which is the more feasible option for Kenya.
Maureen?
I'll answer the question asked whether it's safer to borrow locally, since you have the foreign currency issue due to depreciation. According to the charts that you explained, borrowing locally, I don't think it's safer to borrow locally in the first place because it's expensive. And looking at the interest rates for external and domestic debt, we saw that for every 100 shillings borrowed for the financial year 22-23, that was paid for interest charges, 73 was domestic and 27 was external. And there's also the issue of the crowding out effect, whereby the government borrows mostly from banks, and this denies these other people from accessing loans from banks, the private sector. So it will sort of reduce the growth in the private sector by borrowing locally. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Kwame, maybe you can start with Andrea's question, and then you have two other questions.
Okay, Andrea, I can't help you. I mean, we can't read the minds of politicians. They have fantastic set of advisors on both sides who are very creative. What would worry me if any of them thinks that the possibility of a default, or rather the possibility of a restructuring, is something they have not considered as one of the scenarios. But just like you, we read the documents. They use different language. Some of them used restructuring. I think another one used reprofiling. The detail of each of those will come in when they are suddenly one or the other is in office. The difficult political things to push through, they will require consensus within Parliament as well, because Parliament has overall oversight. That's as much as I can say about that. I don't know any more than you do. Thank you. On Adrian, okay, so you say Japan is offering subsidies then. I think we have to stop this idea of comparing Kenya to Japan and saying Japan does this as well. That's true. But Japan is not in a debt distress position. So if you look at the IMF conditions, it does not say Japan is in a debt distress condition at all. I mean, Japan has debts that are strict. Japan refinancing, I mean, Japan payment of debt as a share of every $100 of spending every year is 12. Kenya's is 56. So you're making a comparison between apples and I don't know what else. So I can't help with that question. That question is not one that can be answered. I don't even think it's relevant for this discussion today. I'm not debating whether subsidies should be made. I don't also know, and I hope it doesn't happen, that subsidies are the way of preventing revolutions, or did you call it unrest? Revolutions or unrest. So that's a very complicated political decision. I mean, political answer that perhaps the IEA is not the best to answer. All I can say is, given Kenya's conditions, my colleague Deborah showed that given Kenya's conditions of high debt distress already last year, all the factors that add to new symptoms that suggest that that distress has become worse were available at the end of the, by the time we are carrying out this. So like everybody else, I don't want Kenyans to feel pain, but if you're considering the possibility of default or restructuring, we think those things are pushing the lever towards the side that would lead to possibility of a default becoming necessary, or at least a discussion that is discussed. That's all I can say for that. Isaac, who else? There's Ringine. I hope I pronounce it right. You say you're just as curious that the current administration is leaving behind 500 billion shillings of pending bills. Yes, it depends on how those pending bills are, but you're right. And the IMF sometimes encourages contingent liabilities and some of these pending bills, especially if they're short-term coming through within, say, some time period, to be considered part of the public debt. They're hidden for, but they're considered part of the public debt. It depends on that. So if you think about that, those are things that also have to be paid. Now, whether they've been planned for in the budget is a different matter altogether. But if they're pending bills, and Kenya has a big pending bills problem, that 500 billion is not small change as well. And it adds significantly to the flexibility in the public finance management that Kenya does. So yes, I think transparency around them is also questioned. Usually when you have an administration moving from one to a new one, sometimes very, very interesting pending bills suddenly show up because that gap allows for some mischief to take place. But yes, there's definitely some pending bills, and if you take it back together with the existing stock of debt, it suggests that the debt stock or the obligations are actually much higher than others. Emmanuel asked a question about whether, you see, Emmanuel, the history. Okay, so let me give an example. The earliest, I was reading someone from a guy called Lee Buchheit, who's a lawyer who's very good at, an economist who's very good at managing negotiations on behalf of clients for solving debt restructuring. And one of the things that he, rather, if you look at the history, I was looking at the economics texts, and it tells you that debt defaults are actually not new. The earliest recorded debt default that economists have was in 4 BC, when 10 cities, I think in Greece, sorry to mention Greeks again, when 10 cities in Greece failed to pay their debts. This is 4 BC, before the Common Era. So debt, and since then, an IMF report also shows that I think since it was formed, there have been about 100 instances of defaults and restructuring and a few other minor problems here and there. So it's far more common that we give credit for, and each of them takes a different trend of its own. But there are certain things that lead to it. One of them is poor public debt management to begin with, when a country doesn't have. And then management of public finances, rather, of which, of course, public debt is one of them. So fiscal policy management is one. And then the second one is if you have fiscal policy management and then a shock takes place, whether it's COVID or a flood or something that damages the economy structurally, then obviously it creates a condition in which even when a country is willing, it is not able to pay that debt. So there's a path. Now, the sooner a country admits that there's a debt payment problem that might issue or a default might issue, the better. But the political pressures are not such as it is. So you don't expect the Treasury, for instance, or a political administration to say we've managed it so badly that we're actually seeking to restructure, because it can create political results that an administration or the people who run it on. If you think about Sri Lanka, that's precisely what happened. They stayed until it was too late, and when the economic and macroeconomic effects became undeniable, obviously it led to a regime change, right? In one form or the other, whether it's a full change or it's the same people in different configuration. I mean, in different adornments, it's just a completely different, I mean, it's a different matter, but that's what happened. So it has political costs, and those political costs are sometimes what lead to the failure to admit in time that a restructuring might be required. But if you do not do a restructuring in time, if you're lucky, it might resolve itself, but more often than not, what it leads to is the worst condition of a default, and a default is bad for everybody, including the citizens of the country. So yes, if you're going to restructure and the evidence is available, it is better to start early. And if you have, quote unquote, a guiding hand or at least a partner in the form of the IMF, because this is the reason the IMF exists, to deal with countries or sovereign entities that have the kind of financial problems that Kenya might be facing right now. So yes, if you do not do it in time, it leads to a default, and a default has completely different circumstances, I mean, consequences for any country. Thanks.
Thank you. I'd like to give this chance to anyone. Okay, who might want to ask a question orally? You can raise your hand. This is the final chance to anyone who might have a question. But before that, there are two more questions here. So Mustafa asks, hi, it was my observation that the local currency has been depreciating against the dollar over time subsequently. And we know debt is a key component of that. So is there any hope for the local currency to gain value if we clear the debt issue over time? Okay, so that's Mustafa's question. Then Adrian says to Maureen, how is borrowing in your own currency more expensive? The government, via its designated agents, the Treasury and CBK and Parliament, issues or spends currency into existence. You'll simply roll over these debts. Borrowing in foreign currency makes you beholden or makes you want to earn that currency as you can't issue it. The big question is, why are we borrowing in foreign currencies when we have a money of account and issue it? What deficiencies do we have? Are we food sovereign, energy sovereign? Do we export low value added content while importing finished goods? Okay, so Maureen, you will attempt to answer that question, and then Kwame will also add to that. And then Bringine says, sorry if this was tackled before I joined, the issue of counties being able to borrow with guarantees of the national government. I think recently, like Laikipia County got approval to acquire some financing. What will be the interplay with the public debt? So we'll start with you, Maureen, and then we'll come to Kwame, and in case Deborah has anything to add. So your quick thoughts.
Adrian, just to go back to what had been asked before, the question was, is it safer to borrow locally? It wasn't in terms of currency. And also borrowing externally, it's normally sort of a contract with, say, the country that you're borrowing from, or maybe a commercial bank from a different country that you're borrowing from. So it's a contract between the two, and they decide which currency they want the debt to be paid in. Yeah, and I think asking whether we are food sovereign, I think that's a mercantilist argument, and we can't be self-sufficient in food. And Kwame will help me answer the rest. Thank you.
Thanks, Maureen. Kwame?
don't know why my camera isn't coming on, but let me just answer the question nevertheless. So yes, look, borrowing domestically or borrowing in a domestic currency or borrowing in a foreign currency are substitutes, and each of them has its unique risks. So if you borrow foreign currency, there are two things that happen. You could find concessional loans where the interest rates are very low. Remember, the function of a loan are just three things: the principal, rate of interest, and the duration of the loan, the time. But if you think about borrowing for the same amount of money, you could borrow in a foreign currency. And if you borrow in a foreign currency, what tends to happen is the interest rates tend to be very low. However, the risk that comes with that is the risk of a foreign exchange depreciation. So if a depreciation takes place, then obviously the loan in Kenya shillings becomes more expensive. So that's what you're trading off with the fact that if you're borrowing domestically, government borrowing domestically in Kenya is actually part of Kenya's structural problem. Because if government borrows domestically, it is competing with local enterprises, mostly SMEs, which are not able to find money because anyone who's lending money prefers to lend to government at 10% safely without having to chase Kwame, for instance, and small enterprises. So both those have effects. And that's the thing that needs to. Secondly, borrowing internally tends to have, excessive borrowing internally tends to be almost a predictor that it will drive inflation over the long term, especially if government is unable to pay and begins to, quote unquote, print money to pay. So I think we need to be very circumspect in arguing that borrowing internally has no risks. That's a lie, complete lie. Borrowing externally has risks, borrowing internally has risks. How a government mixes those two is what competent public finance management does. There's no such thing. Countries that are able to borrow internally, only internally, such as the US, don't borrow internally. They borrow in their own currency, but they're also borrowing from other, banks from other places and stuff like that. So it's how you manage the entire monetary policy and fiscal policy calculus is what ensures that you're able to make the most efficient use of resources available locally and resources available from international sources.
Great, thank you for that. We are winding up now, and I wanted to give someone one last opportunity to orally ask a question, but because I don't see any hands, anyone? Okay, Francis Charo. So Francis will be the last one to ask their question, and then Itoto also asks, how is debt forgiveness factored into sovereign debt? What would be the implications in debt restructuring? So Kwame will respond to that. So Francis, you could please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Okay, good afternoon. Just a quick one. I'm just eager and trying to figure it out, like if the country move to adopt it, maybe we want to have the debt restructuring. My concern is the impact on this to the investors, considering currently there's a new regime that is coming in. And we have seen like the length on the processes, like it may take 5 years or so. And considering the regime will be there for only 5 years, and then we'll have another election. Yeah, thank you.
All right, thanks, Francis. So as we wind, I don't see any other questions. So as we close, I'll invite Maureen to, if you can respond to that, but also make your closing remarks, and Deborah as well, and then I'll come to Kwame. So Maureen, your closing remarks, and if you could respond to that.
Okay. I don't have any closing remark to make, but thank you everyone for attending. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Maureen. Deborah, closing remarks.
Thank you for attending the meeting, and we hope that you'll be leaving the meeting with more public debt literacy.
Okay. And finally, Kwame.
Okay. So answering Itoto's question, debt forgiveness. So we said that the tools of debt restructuring are the principal, the interest rates, and the time, right? Each of which could be adjusted. Debt forgiveness is a combination of those three, where you say, we wipe away all the debt. Kenya has never been, but there are countries in Africa which actually benefited in the Jubilee. Remember the Jubilee challenge, which was basically asking OECD countries to forgive the debts that were owed by low-income countries, and some countries actually benefited from that debt. So your debt goes all the way back to zero, or some components of that debt went back to zero. So that would be debt forgiveness. So debt forgiveness is where both the interest, it's just wiping out your slate so that you can start anew. It's as if you did not owe that debt, and that can happen. So that would be one. That would be one extreme form of a debt restructuring. And again, it would mean that the contract would have to be redrawn to say, look, this is wiped, the obligation does not exist, and then you do. One of the things that happens under a debt forgiveness program is actually the money that is saved on the part of the Jubilee debt forgiveness that many African countries benefited from in the year 2000 to 2002, was that you're then committed, the countries are then committed to use the money for social investment. So for instance, African countries were told, or some countries were told, because this money because you've been forgiven, please use that money, direct that money to social services, which is education and public health. So it's not unconditional, but it's a way of trying to make sure that, yes, some money is available, but at least it redirects the structure of the economy by making government spend money prudently and in ways that benefit the public. So that actually that forgiveness is as if it's actually a forgiveness that is granted to the citizens and not necessarily to a regime or a government. Guys, I think we are all very concerned about how the elections resolve itself, but we can't resolve that for you at the IE. I think those who are supposed to resolve it would resolve it. And then the new administration will make decisions about whether it wants to borrow more or not borrow more, and Parliament will do that its work in terms of the oversight that it needs to ensure that the debt kill. Remember, Kenya has a unique constitution because our constitution does not contemplate a default. Debts have to be paid, and that's part of the reason why Parliament has been placed. So because the Constitution does not contemplate a default, I'm therefore persuaded that it shows the government needs to explore any policy that prevents a default from happening. If that policy includes restructuring, then I think it's constitutionally allowed. That's all we can say. I don't think that we can make other clever arguments. I don't know how else what other clever arguments we would. So I'll answer this final question before I close. Yes, is it Ringine or Regina? Oh, Ringine. Sorry, I hope. It's true that the government, or rather the Constitution and the PFM, Public Finance Management Act, requires the Treasury to actually underwrite or to guarantee debts by county governments. And yes, you mentioned Laikipia, which has done that. Now that's supposed to be a screening device to ensure that debt, specific debt, is for specific purposes and that the Treasury then enforces. But yes, that becomes part of the sovereign debt because it's owed to other people and it becomes part of the sovereign debt. As we speak about Argentina and other parts of Latin America, which have had regular, the debt by subnational governments or county level governments can also be very, very destabilizing, because if they go on a spree and they are not able to pay, it means automatically that our debt becomes the responsibility of the sovereign. So part of the reason why we should scrutinize, or it's a good thing to scrutinize those, including Parliament, to pay a little bit more attention and provide specific definite policy process for ensuring that there's a clearance house for that, is just for that reason, that because the economy is one, all these aggregations that we have in the form of counties and all other forms are actually artificial as far as the economy is concerned. So if there's a debt that has been appropriated in one place, it obviously becomes sovereign debt and obviously adds to the risk, even if they're small amounts to begin with. Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay, so thanks a lot. Thanks to all our speakers today, the presenters. Thank you, Maureen. Thanks, Deborah, and thanks, Kwame, for preparing this presentation and sharing those useful insights with us. At IE, we hope that for all our participants, as Debbie said, you leave with a few more insights regarding Kenya's public debt issue, some better understanding on the fundamentals on restructuring Kenya's debt. Is it an option? Yes, we've seen it it is actually a viable option, but it's up to the next regime to see how to go about it. So I thank all our presenters for putting that together, and thank you to all the participants for attending and staying through to the end of this discussion. So as is our practice, we will share this presentation. It will be available on the IEA's website. We are also available for further discussions on the subject on IEA's digital platforms. You can follow us at IEA Kenya on Twitter and all other social media platforms. Then lastly, IEA is a membership institution, as most of you might know. So for those of you who are not members and you would be interested in being a member, please get in touch with us through our communications department, and you'll be advised on how and what benefits would accrue to you if you became a member. So on behalf of the IEA, I thank you once again for joining this discussion. Please look out for more notices regarding our webinars. We have another webinar on a completely different subject on Friday. The notice is available on IEA's website, so please look out for that on Friday at 11 a.m. If you can make some time and attend that, we would also appreciate your presence. So thanks everyone, and have a good afternoon. Bye.